Hi, I'm Gemma. I'm the Executive Coordinator, and we are excited to have professional from CSUN Internal Audit today to talk with you all.
Before we get started, here are the announcements for this. Please join us Saturday, November 6th for a Panda fundraiser from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. at North Street to support the LA Bank. Monday, November 8th, we will have pension assurance to present saving for your future topic. And Monday, November 8th at 5 p.m., we will have an alumni panel. Also, we encourage everyone to have their cameras on, and please wait until the end to ask questions with the raise hand feature in Zoom. Without further ado, please feel free to take it away.
We have Howard from CSUN Internal Audit presenting on internal audit versus external audit. Howard, take it away.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being invited again to speak to your group. I've been speaking to your group for many, many years now, and I appreciate the ongoing invitations for so many semesters. It's been a pleasure. So I've been an internal auditor for most of my professional career. Let's talk about, let's see, we're not advancing the slides. There we go. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about today. A little bit about me, some background on what internal audit is, a discussion of risk and controls. The reason I do that because it's helpful to understand what internal audit is when you have an understanding of risk and controls. Then we'll discuss a little bit about what the differences are between internal audit versus external audit. Then we'll talk about the CIA or Certified Internal Auditor exam. It's a professional examination for internal auditing. And then I'm going to discuss a internship I have available coming up this summer. And feel free to ask any questions during the presentation. It may be a little tricky sometimes to follow the chat while you're doing the presentation, but I'll try to answer everyone's question. So you can read a little bit about me. I'm a graduate of CSUN. I worked for PwC prior to working for CSUN's Internal Audit Department. So I have a couple of certifications, one in internal audit and one in fraud. Okay, so what is internal audit? We'll be talking about that, but a lot of people don't understand it, what exactly internal auditors do, and I hope I'll be able to shed some light on that in our presentation today. Even though you may not understand exactly what it is yet, a lot of companies do have internal audit departments. And in fact, all listed companies, any company that's listed on the stock exchange has to have an internal audit function. That wasn't always the case. That started after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act came in. You might have heard about that in some of your classes. The good news is that organizations that have internal auditors, they're paying higher entry-level salaries. There's a lot of projects to do. Schedules are flexible, and there are jobs in public, private, and government. All have openings in internal audit type professions. Sometimes it's not always called internal auditor, sometimes it's examiner or something similar to that. And the other good part about it, you can make a six-figure salary working in internal audit. That's why I have the $6 signs there, in case you're wondering. So here's a sort of a dictionary definition of what internal audit is. It's an independent, objective assurance and consulting activity. It adds value and improves an organization's operations. So the theoretical or sort of classroom version is it brings a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluate and improve the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. All sounds very theoretical, but we'll try to make more sense of it as we go along. So common misconception about internal audit is that it's focused primarily on accounting and finances. And in fact, a lot of the work internal auditors do, and many of the audits and projects that I do here at CSUN have nothing to do with accounting and finances. One example that has nothing to do with accounting and finances is grades. So we all get grades in our classes. It has nothing to do with accounting and finances, but it's something that there's risk and there's internal controls. So it's a topic that an internal audit could be done about. So since it's not just accounting and finances, we're looking at all aspects of the organization. We look at processes and procedures. We confirm accuracy of information. And as we do our work and we make recommendations to either improve or establish internal controls. And then a big part of the whole internal audit process is after you've made the recommendations and everyone agrees on them, we need to follow up to make sure that the corrective actions are implemented. So in a typical company, not a university, there's a number of things that an internal auditor could look at, like purchasing or cash, manufacturing, payroll, etc. A university has some unique types of functions that you're all probably familiar with. Admissions, that's how they decided who was able to take classes here at CSUN. Grade reporting, as we touched on. Housing and dorms, unique to a university. Fundraising and construction are not necessarily unique to universities, but they have their certain unique aspects in the higher education environment. Another thing fairly unique to university is athletics, all areas that can be audited. And as you might see, not every single one of these has anything to do with accounting or finances. Some do, some have aspects of accounting and finance, but they don't, that's not their primary function. Okay, so to better understand internal audit, I wanted to touch on the concept of risk. I'm sure you've all heard the word risk and kind of have an idea of what it means. But in the context of an organization, a way to think of risk is any issue that could prevent an organization from achieving its objectives. And to understand and manage risk, we have to get an understanding of the concept of internal control. And that's what we'll spend some more time on. So here's the kind of the definitions of internal controls. They're basically the steps taken to obtain reasonable assurance that objectives are achieved. They're the policies and procedures that help ensure management directives are carried out. So internal controls are real important. They reduce the likelihood of errors and make sure there's accountability, effective and efficient operations, reliable management reporting, compliance with laws and regulations, and protecting of assets, including organizational reputation. Okay, so that sounds a little technical, and we're going to talk about internal controls in a way that's probably more accessible to everyone in layman's terms. So one way to think of internal controls, it's mechanisms that are in place to either prevent errors from entering the process or detecting errors once they've occurred. And another simple way to think of internal controls, it's those things that management relies on to make sure things don't get goofed up. Okay, so let's think about your own internal control systems. You probably didn't know you had internal control systems, but we all do. So think back to when you actually came to campus. I didn't want to revise the PowerPoint just for the lockdown period, but just think about when you came to campus, or when you do come to campus, do you lock the doors to your home? And why would you do that? So maybe you put something in chat. I'll look at that later. So you want to obviously make sure your possessions are not stolen, that no one else can access them. What about the PIN for your ATM card? Do you keep it confidential and in a safe place? What about your bank accounts? Usually when I speak to you guys in person, I ask for a show of hands for these things. So you can do that virtually too, if you want. So do you reconcile your checking account or any bank account or a credit card you might have? Do you compare your credit card statement charges with your receipts? Because sometimes there's mistakes, sometimes there's even fraud. So it's a good thing to have your own internal controls. Okay, so let's take a sort of a case study about internal controls. And our objective is getting to campus. So I put in pre-pandemic there. So we want to get to campus. We want to get there on time. We want to be able to park and walk to our class or whatever. But there are a number of things that could prevent us. There are risks involved in meeting our objective. And the way we deal with those risks, we try to mitigate the risk, are the internal controls that we implement for ourselves. Okay, so think about the risks that are associated with getting to campus. And I'm sure you're all thinking about that. So here's a list we've put together over the years when I've spoken to your group and other groups about this topic. So one risk is traffic, right? It's a fact of life in Southern California, there's going to be traffic. Another risk, parking. Another one, you could get a speeding ticket in your quest to be here on time. Your car could break down. You could have a flat tire. You can get up late. You could have an accident. You could run out of gas. You could be sick. You have a dead battery, all these things. So for each of these risks, there's some potential internal controls, we'll call them personal internal controls, that we could implement to reduce that risk. So what about traffic? What would help you mitigate the risk of traffic? So some of the ones we've thought of over the years are the Wave app, Google Maps, things like that. It used to be, you could listen on the radio, hear about traffic, probably not so much these days, but all these things that you could do. So what would be the internal control you could implement to reduce the risk of not finding a parking place? There's really only one, isn't there? It's arriving early. All right, how about the risk of getting a speeding ticket? Well, that's pretty simple too, follow the speed limit. What about the risk of your car breaking down? That's a little more complicated, involves some advanced planning and making sure you get, your oil changes and things like that on a regular basis. Flat tire. Well, maybe you took a driver's training or ed class at some point in your life, and they probably said, check all the tires before you drive off. And of course, nobody does anymore. But if you do, you might notice that you might have a flat tire. All right, getting up late. There's a lot of strategies I've heard. Sometimes, everyone has an alarm on their phone now. So some people say set multiple alarms. So how to avoid an accident? Drive defensively. But if you do have an accident, there's something in place that can help you mitigate some of the risk involved. And that's, of course, car insurance. That's a way of helping defray the risk to you personally. What about running out of gas? Well, you don't want to observe your fuel gauge. So that's sort of an internal control that's built in to your car. So you might not think about all these things being internal controls, but when you have the sort of the mindset of an internal auditor and look at objectives, risk, and controls, you can think of a lot of things that you do in your daily life as internal controls. And of course, illness, that's on a lot of people's mind these days, healthy diet, exercise, checkups, that kind of thing. And a dead battery, check your headlights, make sure you turn them off, and you might want to store jumper cables in your car, or called AAA. Okay, so I hope that helped give you sort of a flavor of what internal controls are all about and why we have them. And of course, we have them in our personal life, and of course, in an organization, in a business, in a firm, lots of internal controls are in place. So some of you probably had or have had or may still have some entry-level retail jobs in your either high school or while you're in college. And you might have gotten some training and orientation You might have been given written policies and procedures. All these things are another way of describing internal controls. They want you to do things a certain way because the management wants these things to be in place, and they've established the policies or internal controls to make that happen. A significant internal control is called separation or sometimes segregation of duties. You don't want one person having multiple duties that could be incompatible, like receiving cash, accounting for cash, and then reconciling. If the same person is doing that, there's a risk of fraud. So that's why those duties and functions are typically separated. An internal control you might have seen in some of your positions is cash drawer counts. That's usually at the end of the day, end of shift, might involve another person, you reconcile to a cash register of some kind. So those are all internal controls, and those are all things that are a regular feature of retail operations. Okay, so here's another case study. This involves some students actually here at CSUN. Several students reported that the final grades they expected were not what they actually received. So how could this possibly have happened? Well, the easy answer, the system was hacked. And we'll describe how it happened. So we'll talk a little more about that. So there were some students taking a class, and the professor happened to be a very open and friendly person, talked a lot about her life. So during the course of the semester, she told her students where she grew up, what high school she went to, the name of her pet, all things like that. So the students who weren't too happy with their grades and wanted to change their grades, they tried to enter the grade reporting system as if they were the professor. Now, it's fairly easy to find someone's email address, right? That's pretty much public information. So you'd write the email address of the professor or their ID. It's usually the first initial, their first name, and then their last name. It's usually sometimes it's the ID for a very faculty member. And then they put in whatever, and they said, oh, looks like you forgot your password. And so do you need, one of the ways that happens, you've probably seen in some of your interactions on the internet, if you don't remember your password, they might ask you, what are your security questions? So here was the flaw that the student seized upon. Because they were very familiar with the professor, they were able to answer the security question, which was, what high school did you go to? So the students knew, they entered that, changed the password, and then changed their grades. So that's how that happened. So that's a case of internal control, that problem that was compromised. And it's an example of an audit issue that had nothing to do with finances. And that's why I wanted to kind of bring that to your attention. So there's a lot of examples like that you can research about, but I wanted to give you sort of a high level comparison of what the differences are between an internal audit and external audit. So with internal audit, there's a broad focus. We do look at financials. They have to be accurate. We're looking at efficiency and effectiveness. We're also making sure that objectives are accomplished. And as we talked about the objective, risk, and controls, we want to see objectives being accomplished. Compliance with laws and policies, that's always paramount. Safeguarding of assets and internal controls. So from a employment standpoint, in terms of qualifications, you need a pretty diverse skill set. You need to be able to understand operations as well as financial statements. Internal auditors are part of the organization. They're not an outside team, generally speaking. There are some exceptions. So with external audit, there's a specific focus. we're looking at the accuracy of financial statements. If the entity is a going concern, with external audit, you're generally speaking focusing on historical data that already happened. We're also looking at compliance with accounting and other regulations. And the internal controls, external auditors do look at internal controls, but they're looking at the internal controls related specifically to financial reporting, not internal controls over all operations. So from a perspective of what you need to have as a future employee, accounting skills is a very primary focus. And another aspect in comparison to an internal audit is that you're independent from the organization. So an accounting firm does an audit of another company. So the company being audited hires the external auditor, whereas a company with an internal audit, the internal auditor is part of the organization. Okay, so we'll focus on that just a little bit more. Don't want to be too boring, but and save time for questions. But so I want to focus on these aspects of internal audit versus external audit in a little more detail. So with internal audit, and I can make these slides available for your reference as well. So with internal audit, we're looking at all these things, and external audit, we're attesting to the accuracy of the financial statements and the adequacy of internal controls over financial reporting. The standards that internal auditors follow, it's the Institute of Internal Auditors, that's the IIA, they're international standards. And external audit, there's various appropriate accounting and audit standards that you're probably familiar with, such as GAAP. Fraud is an interesting topic when it comes to internal audit versus external audit. So internal auditors may actually investigate allegations of fraud. And we also might review what preventive controls are in place to make sure that fraud doesn't happen. And if it does, what controls are in place to detect fraud. With external auditors, fraud is not a primary focus, and there's some work that takes into account, has there been fraud that affects the financial statement? That's kind of the difference. So there might be, let's say, a very large organization, let's say like McDonald's, and there's some cashier steals a few dollars. Does that have a material impact on the financial statements? It's still fraud, but it doesn't have a material impact. So with internal audit, part of the work product is making recommendations in a report. So we want to make sure that the things that we find that could be a problem are corrected, and we make recommendations for that corrective action. External auditors do the same thing. The difference is the external auditors only come once a year, and they'll come back and say, how did you do on your corrective action? Whereas internal audit, they're here, they're at the company all the time, and they want to make sure that corrective action takes place in a timely manner. Okay, so in summary, internal auditors, they work for the company and provide guidance, and external auditors are third parties hired to provide an opinion on financial statements. So what about working as an internal auditor? There's some interesting work-life balance things that come up. With internal audit, your hours are much more predictable. External auditors, you might be familiar with some of your friends and fellow students, long hours during the busy seasons. Internal auditors, you're an employee of the company, but with external audit, you're independent of the company. With internal audit, there's usually an annual audit plan where you decide what areas you're going to do. And that's not so much, so that's sort of a broad plan of what you can do for the entire year. With external audit, you're really focused on the various deadlines for financial reporting. From a day-to-day aspect of time reporting, with internal audit, it's more project-based. For whatever specific audit you're working on, you focus on that in terms of the time you work on it. You might work on several audits at once, so you divide your time. With external audit, you focus on the client because the accounting firm is going to be billing the client. With internal audit, generally work at the company's sites. And with external audit, you work at client sites. So when I worked for PwC, I almost never went to PwC's offices. I was virtually at the client sites, probably 95% of the time I worked there. So within the internal audit field, there's some specialties. In particular, the one that's probably the most high paying and in demand is information technology auditors, or IT auditors, or IS auditors are also known. There's also a specific certification for IT auditors called CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor. And it's given by this organization called ISACA. So if you're interested in auditing, interested in IT, you like computers, you like helping people use computers better and focusing on technology, that might be a viable career path. All the big accounting firms, they hire people with IT audit specialties. So and that's generally pays higher, at least in the beginning stages, than someone who is focusing on the CPA route, at least in the entry level. Other specialties in internal audit are healthcare, banking, gaming and hospitality. All the hotels in Las Vegas, they have big internal audit staffs, as you might imagine. And of course, the government hires lots of auditors. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a certification. It's called Certified Internal Auditor. You need to have a bachelor's degree to get the CIA designation. You need references. You have to have experience. Of course, you have to pass an exam. A little bit more about that in a second. But the big difference between the CIA and the CPA exam and some other professional exams is that you can take the CIA exam while you're a student. You can, before you're graduating, and while you're, like I like to say to some of the interns I've had over the years, while you're in the midst of being in school and taking lots of classes and exams, you're in the mode of taking exams, so it's a good time to try to pass that exam. So the more kind of acronyms and initials behind your name, kind of the higher your salary can be. So once you get some sort of professional certification, this is no different. You're required to maintain your knowledge and skills with continuing education. So here's a little bit about the exam. It's about internal auditing, about the various topics in internal auditing, including fraud, how audits are done, the planning and performing and the results. And part 3 has a lot of the topics that you cover in your business degree. So information security, financial management, overall business acumen. So not specific to audit, it's very wide ranging, but it's sort of general business knowledge. Okay, so over the years, past 18, 19 years or so, I've had 32 interns work for me as the internal audit intern for the department here at CSUN. Usually the position lasts for a semester. It can be a summer break in a semester, sometimes 2 semesters, but had quite a few interns, and they've been all very helpful in helping me do the work of internal audit. So part of the responsibilities are working on audit reports, work papers, getting supporting documentation, reviewing for compliance, assisting on investigations of fraud cases. Those can't be scheduled, of course, but those tend to be the most interesting. And some of the benefits, and I think one of my former interns is on here at the meeting. Some of the benefits, it helps with your writing and communication, improves your technical skills with Excel, Word, PowerPoint, Outlook. And some of the advantages to working on campus, as well as, at least when things are open, is flexible work hours. Try to work around your class schedule. And I do have an opening for an internal audit intern, and that will be for this summer, starting in May of next year. And Miriam, if you're at the meeting, if you'd care to say a few words about the internship.
Of course. Hi, Mr. Lutwak. Hi, everyone. I actually had my internship, I believe, spring of 2020. It was half in person, half virtual, so I experienced them both. So one of the things I actually very much loved about the internship was the way that Mr. Lutwak actually walks you through everything. It's a step-by-step. He tells you everything in the morning, what we're gonna do, or if we have an audit, any meetings or everything. You guys pretty much have like a hands-on experience. You will pretty much see what he's doing. So you're gonna learn a lot. And another cool thing was that every morning, actually, Mr. Lutwak would send me a lot of articles that were very interesting to read about fraud or the things that were happening actually in the internal audit world that I really enjoyed. And I also used it a lot in my interviews when I was doing I was looking for a job with all the firms. So I had interviews with Big Fours and mid-tiers. And actually, the second they looked at that, they were like, oh, so you did internal audit internship. How was it? And that was an amazing conversation that was like, okay, I did this and that. And they were like, okay, so you have an understanding of internal audit. So it helps you eventually with your external audit, because I wanted to do an external audit. And to me, it's like an amazing opportunity. You guys definitely need to take advantage of it. I'm not sure if it's going to be in person next year or virtual, but either way, I think it's an amazing thing to have on your resume, actually. And thank you, Mr. Lutwak. I really appreciate you.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam. I couldn't have said it better. Really appreciate it. So
you.
One of the things that I've heard from many of the interns is that in the interview process, when you're being interviewed by Big Four firms or all levels of firms in various industries, when you have something specific to speak about and to say, well, I did this, we had internal control findings, and it really impresses the people interviewing you, and it just helps with your overall knowledge of the business world. When you take the auditing class as part of the accounting degree, there's not a lot of focus on internal audit. There might be a paragraph or two, but there is focus on internal controls. But like I said in the presentation, it's generally focused on the internal controls around financial statement reporting. All right, so I'd be happy to take any other questions you might have.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
So I'm actually really curious about, so Miriam really did briefly say you tell the task each morning, but can you just like briefly say like what daily tasks are, or what you do on like daily day?
Good. Right, so so at any point in time, there might be 2 or 3 audits that are in various stages of operation, either starting, in the middle, completion. So we focus on, well, what's the status of this audit and what are we going to do regarding this audit today? Is there follow-up we need to do? Do we need to contact someone? What meetings are we going to go to today? What meetings are we going to have this week? What documentation do we need to review this week? So it varies, because we get a lot of various entities who audit CSUN. So it's not just audits that I do, it's also various government agencies, the CSU management of the CSU, they come and do audits of us. So we go about, what do we need to do, what specific tasks. We have monthly reporting that we do. We have regular reports that we have to do about the status of various things. So we review, here's what we need to do broadly this week, and here's what we need to do specifically today.
Joel, you have question?
Yes, good afternoon, Mr. Lutwak. I hope
Yes.
everything's well with you. I just want to know, what was your most memorable experience working in, the auditing department at CSUN?
Oh, there's so many. But certainly some of the major frauds have been surprising, that people try to take advantage of the system, where one employee created a fake fee that she charged certain students and said, you need to pay this fee to me in order to do X so that you can progress in your academic career. You need to pay this fee, without being too specific. You needed to pay this fee to me in cash. And lots of students paid that fee. She created a fake form that she gave to these students, and a number of students paid. Now, the reason we're able to figure that out and how that got exposed is there was another issue involving the same employee that a whistleblower had come forward to. So we were investigating that. And while she was being investigated, she was on administrative leave and she was out of the office. So while she was out of the office, one student came in and said, I'm here to pay my fee to Shirley. And everyone else in the office said, well, what fee? What fee are you talking about? How could this be? And then he started to explain it, and he had his money ready to pay. And then one student after another, several students kept coming forward, saying, I'm here to pay my fee. I'm here to pay my fee. So that became a whole big investigation. And that was, it was really surprising that someone would take advantage of the system and do that.
Okay, so any cash collected from students from a faculty member, that's considered, fraud or illegal?
Cash payments to staff or faculty would not be appropriate. That's correct.
Okay, would that be considered like bribery?
Well, I wouldn't know how to characterize it specifically. I don't know. I don't want to go that far, but that would be a specific situation. If you have something you want to talk about, we can maybe go forward offline.
Sure.
But that particular situation was a very surprising one.
Okay, and another question for you, is this internship paid?
Is it paid?
Yes.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, all right, great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
What happened to the professor, if I don't mind asking?
Yeah, it wasn't a professor. It was a staff person who worked in an office that dealt with students. So she was eventually charged with fraud. She was convicted. She was terminated, and she had to pay back the money. So there were consequences. Yeah, absolutely.
One question. So for the external auditors, what specific skills do you think they need to have to be successful at their job? Because they are not at the workplace to ask some questions for help. They're on their own. So what do you think? Like, what specific skills do they really need to have?
Yeah, well, I did external auditing in terms of I did internal audit on a contract basis. So I worked for PwC and did internal audit work at various companies. So that is a good question about who do you go to for the information. So you really have to find someone that is has the patience. That's particularly at your entry level. So you have to, when you're at an entry level, you really have to talk to your manager or supervisor and say, well, I'm not getting the information I need from the accounting manager at this firm. And you have to kind of go through the proper hierarchy. Do you know what I mean? You can't just go around and say, well, complain and go 2 steps above when you have to kind of work through the system. But you have to have an open mind. You have to be analytical and think, well, how can I get this information? If you're doing this in the virtual environment, and so probably some of you already have internships with some of the firms, and I'm sure it must be very challenging. And Miriam, you can maybe speak to that, but to get the information from clients in this virtual environment is very challenging, definitely. Okay, anyone else? So I just want to say that having been able to offer this internship over the years, that's probably been my best, memory of this position. I really appreciate being able to help people learn about the internal audit profession. And quite a number of, I have kept track of over 30 interns, and quite a number of them are now working, in fact, in internal audit. Some went the CPA route first and then worked for internal audit, and some went directly to internal audit after graduating.
Sir,
Yes.
Sir Lutwak, good afternoon.
Hi.
Yes, most of us already accepted our offer for summer internship next year. Is there a way that we could have an internship, like even one day per week on spring?
Well, actually, I already have an intern for the spring, so that's why the opening is for summer.
Oh, thank you.
But good question. One time I was at Meet the Firms. It happened to be at, I was working for PwC and was a Meet the Firms at USC. It was kind of a funny story. A student came up to me and said, "I'd really like to have an internship. I'll pay you to be an intern." So we said, "No, we don't do it that way."
Thank you, sir.
Sure, absolutely. I do have a flyer that describes the position, so I can send that to the meeting organizers, and also be sending it to Stuart, who usually distributes it to all the students. So I know summer seems like a really long way away, but as you know from the big firms, they're hiring already for the summer. All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, Mr. Lutwak, I have a question for you. At a minimum of how many hours is this internship per week?
Yeah, it's a student assistant position from the university's perspective, so it's a maximum of 20 hours per week. It doesn't have to be 20 hours. It's usually between 15 and 20 hours per week. During the summer or during winter break, you can work up to 40 hours if there's enough work to do.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Mr. Lutwak for coming, and thank you so much for everyone for coming as well. Really quick reminder, please join us this Saturday, November 6th for a Panda fundraiser from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. at Nordhoff Street to support LA Food Bank. And next Monday, we have the pension assurance meeting, and at 5, we also have an alumni panel, so make sure to chime in and join us. Thank you, guys.